The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 2nd chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended, and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in a group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and years, and in divine and human favor. The Gospel of the Lord. So the days in between Christmas Day and New Year's Day always seem to me like a kind of an in-between time. There's nothing much going on, or at least I hope that there's nothing much going on, and I can relax a little and catch up on some sleep. You may feel like that as well. Many of us are on vacation, and even if we are going to work, there are so few people around, or even paying any attention to email, that it may actually be possible to catch up on a couple of projects we haven't been able to work on for a very long time. So we need these kinds of in-between times, times that are not consumed by the hyperactivity of Christmas or New Year's or something like that. Even the appointed gospel reading for today, this first Sunday during the Christmas season, seems like a story of in-between times. Jesus is no longer a baby, but not yet an adult. In fact, apart from the birth narratives, this is the only story in any of the four Gospels that relates a story about Jesus' childhood. And while the story of the parents or of parents losing track of their child can be a scary story, particularly if anything like that has ever happened to you, it's an utterly normal story, like we might hear today. There are no angelic pronouncements, no miracles, no heavenly voices. Instead, Luke relates a very in-between story that happens after the big festivities of Passover are over. Everybody is heading home, and because people travel in groups for safety, Mary and Joseph assume that Jesus is hanging out with his buddies in some other part of the group. When they find that that is not the case, they carefully retrace their steps, finally ending back in the temple in Jerusalem, where they find Jesus sitting around with the teachers and asking questions. Exasperated, Mary says to Jesus, "Child, why have you done this to? What has compelled you to do this thing?" And Jesus, showing himself to be fully human and fully 12, rolls his eyes and says, "Duh. What's the matter with you dumb parents? Why didn't you know where I was? Because you should. What's the matter?" And with that, they all head home, and we don't hear anything more about Jesus for almost another 20 years. In fact, all the years between Jesus' birth and his baptism by John at the Jordan River at about the age of 30 seem like in-between years. Nothing much is reported about them, and even this story seems like a routine event between big cosmic changes. So it makes you wonder, why did Luke waste paper and bother to include the story at all? So some scholars think that he wanted to point out Jesus' humanity by acting fully human and even fully like a 12-year-old. Some scholars think that Luke included it since Jesus goes home with Mary and Joseph and he's obedient to them, fulfilling that great, most important commandment that we talk about in confirmation, honor your parents, and they want to show how Jesus is really obedient to following all of the commandments. And there are some scholars who also think that Luke wanted to use this story as a way to show Jesus' commitment to God and to devotion to God by the way he sat for days in the temple, listening, learning, asking questions. All those things are possible, but I think there's also a message here about living and experiencing God in the in-between times. Because in fact, even for Mary and Joseph, the big cosmic events, the hearing of angels, the having of dreams, and all this other kind of stuff that happened, were few and far between. Most of their lives, like most of ours, often feel like kind of in-between times. And yet, Jesus was living and growing in the midst of those in-between times. And even if nothing miraculous seemed to be happening, God was at work, calling Mary and Joseph and the whole world into a deeper and more meaningful relationship with Him. So what does this story tell us about living and experiencing God in the in-between times? It seems to me that as utterly common and as ordinary as some of the actions of Mary and Joseph were, they show us that living faithfully in the in-between times is often about keeping our eyes open and looking diligently for what God is doing in our lives. You know, Mary and Joseph did not just figure, hey, Jesus will show up eventually. They went back and they looked. They retraced their steps. They watched and they looked for clues. And sometimes, I think for us, we tend to be in a situation sometimes where we go, you know, I'm not sure what God is doing in my life, or even if God is doing anything right now. But, you know, if God wants me to know about it, God will do some big dramatic thing and show me this great sign, and then I'll know the direction God's trying to point me in my life. Sometimes that happens for us, as sometimes it happened for Mary and Joseph. But often living in the in-between times is just about faithfully looking around and going, I'm noticing something over there. I'm seeing something happen in my life in here. I wonder if God's trying to tell me something. I wonder if God's trying to point me in a direction. I wonder if that's a clue. I don't know for a while, but watching for those kinds of things, as Mary and Joseph, probably as they were traveling back looking for Jesus, asked people, looked in places, that was all part of their journey of faith in the in-between times, and that's often how it is for us as well. Sometimes for us too, living faithfully in the in-between times is about wrestling with what God is doing, even and especially when we can't figure it all out. Sometimes we're looking and we're listening and we're hearing things and we're wondering, well, what's this all about? It's interesting that in today's gospel reading, there's a line that's repeated from the Christmas Eve gospel. Mary treasured these things in her heart. This is what Luke says happened when the shepherds came and they told Mary and Joseph and everybody what the angels had said. It says Mary treasured these things in her heart. And after this whole routine where Jesus is lost and they find him and they go home, the text again says Mary treasured these things in her heart. So I was thinking about that word. What does it mean to treasure something in your heart? And I discovered it's a really bizarre way to translate the Greek word. Because treasured, especially at this time of year, sounds like that Christmas tree ornament that's so special and wonderful, and we treasure it and we stash it away in a box and we keep it as a warm, fuzzy memory. But that's not really what the word means. It actually means to keep with concern. That is, to hold on to something and say, I don't know what this means. I got to figure this out. I got to wrestle with it. And so when Mary is said to be treasuring these things in her heart, it's not a sweet, warm, it's a, oh my gosh, what does that mean? And how does this fit in with the rest of my life? And the idea is that she spends the rest of her life wrestling with what all this means. And sometimes in the in-between times in our lives, what God is calling us to do is to wrestle with stuff. To look around, to think, to take all this stuff that we've heard and seen and ask God, what does this mean for me? And how am I supposed to take this and live my life in the light of what you're doing? Wrestling is an important thing in living in the in-between times. And maybe one of the most kind of important things about living in in-between times is simply going about our everyday lives. You know, it just seems like the story should end with some kind of dramatic thing. At least Mary and Joseph should have said, we have found Jesus. Now let's go up and offer this great sacrifice because we're here at the temple anyway, and the angels should sing it. But nothing like that happens. They pick up Jesus and they say, all right, we're already 3 days behind. Let's go home. And they go home. and they go about living their everyday lives. And it's in the context of living their everyday lives that Luke says Jesus grew in stature and in divine and human favor. Growth happened in the context of just living your everyday lives, living your life in those in-between times. Sometimes we spend, at least I know I spend my time occasionally going, okay, what special, unique thing does God want me to do? Sometimes the best work God does through me, and probably through you too, is just when we're living faithfully in our everyday lives, being instruments of God's love in the lives of our neighbors and our friends and our coworkers, being the person who's there that God can work through at that moment. Living in the in-between times sometimes just means living and being open to whatever God's calling us to do in the moment, even if it doesn't seem like a big dramatic thing. So today, as we are in kind of the middle of the Christmas season, we really are in some in-between times. But often, that's exactly where God needs us to be. God's always working in our lives, in calling us to be part of what He's doing. And even though being part of God's plan sometimes happens and involves unique and dramatic moments, most of the time, God is working in us, through us, and with us, precisely at those times where we think, this time just seems like one of the in-between times.